Welcome everyone to week 5. Okay, so we're going to go from the idea of the politics of language to, broadly speaking, the politics of culture in a transnational context. And before I begin with the lecture today, I want us to reflect on the connections between 4 and 5, right? We need to start thinking that transnational contexts, their networks and their actors are created in this location by nature, that different actors, when we are in the transnational scene, lack the coherence, the materiality of a national context. Therefore, we need to start thinking in terms of different layers that will give us access to this transnational context. And I will be doing this from week to week, but you also need to do the job of connecting, putting together these different layers, right? So one of the layers is the idea that in this location, the main factor that that is in effect in this transnational context is the creation of different power dynamics, and different power dynamics at different layers that can be seen from different angles. And in the case, for instance, of the politics of language, it was access to different communities, how access is barred by the state, how it has given power to linguistic communities, can create access and also ban the access from other communities, right? And this plays out at the level of the nation state, but also transnationally, right? When we think about language in a geopolitical context, right? So now today, we're gonna go from that linguistic setting into a cultural setting. And we're gonna be looking at this through documentary film, but really through the idea of documentation. But documentary film is the kind of most visual, most effective way, in my opinion, to see how these languages of the real, and when I say the real here in quotation marks, I mean discursive reality, how reality has a discourse and different discourses are created and therefore affect the way we perceive and understand reality, and how this is done in a transnational context. And the first thing, before we get into the actual documentary, I want us to reflect about these cultural politics of the real. Remember, when we're talking about the real, I'm talking about a discursive reality. And this discursive reality can be as potent, if not more potent, that reality, objective reality, or even scientific reality as it is, right? Because this discursive reality is the stuff that we see in the media. It is the stuff that politicians uttered and project in the way they view the nation or a political matter for that. In some cases, it is in the everyday, right? This discursive realities and in there every day. And documentaries are these visual tools that produce a certain type of the real. And this production has to do with the prioritization of the showing and of evidence of what is of data by unshowing the fictional undercurrent that weaves together this documentary reality. Because remember that the showing of data needs to be explained, right? And in this explanation, you are creating a type of discourse. And this discourse, we can call it telling. And this discourse is a type of fiction. which doesn't mean it's not real. Again, it's not that it's not real, it's that it's a narrative, it's a discursive reality. And we can call it fiction, just maybe an exaggerated term, but it's a type of fiction. It's a type of fiction, which again, that doesn't mean that it's not real, or that that the data is problematic. Is that data need to be explained, and in that explanation, we always are creating some type of fiction, some type of discursive reality. Okay, and what happens with documentaries, or the main or the most interesting point of documentaries, is because they are ways of seeing the truth, and they have become the most popular visual tools that we have in contemporary society to see these hidden truths, to unhide the truth, to unearth the truth from other parts of the world, right? And if we go back to the first documentaries, we can see this telling, this fictionalized reality, this discursive reality, much more clearly, precisely because these first documentaries were way less sophisticated, right? And we can see really how they began as ethnographies of other peoples. It was a way for us in the West to understand them somewhere else in the world, right? And then Flaherty's Nanook of the North, which was regarded as the first documentary, is one of those prime examples. And we're going to see one of the most iconic scenes. And this igloo scene in which we see Nanook, an Inuit in Alaska, building that igloo, right? The problem is that that scene that you will see now, it's a stage scene. It did not happen, precisely because they need to build the igloo had to be big enough for the camera to be inside, which would result in the dome collapsing. So what they did is they built half of the igloo and pretended that that was the actual igloo building. So I just want to show you, just so you have a reference in there, because it's a really iconic scene. See, and the importance here is not so much that the igloo scene was staged, is that this was a piece of ethnography. It was a way to understand something, that a cultural truth that was hidden at the time. And in order for that cultural truth to have impact, Flaherty thought that we audiences at the time needed to see a version of reality, and that version of reality in the building of the igloo was way more important than the actual reality, that the actual way of building an igloo, which wouldn't have had that dramatic effect. And without the dramatic effect, the audiences at the time wouldn't have understood, right? And that, in that way, that's how a discursive reality is created, how a type of fiction is created. And there are different ways of creating this type of fictions. And here is the key. The key is that this way of producing reality, when we understand that documenting reality is not just a way to show raw data and that the audiences will interpret or even have the tools to interpret that raw data. If we stay away from that kind of naive perspective of the way evidence is presented in all type of contexts, and even in academic settings, but that's a whole different matter. But in the most popular mediums, which is film documentaries, but also written documentaries, documentary reports, as we will see just in a second, the idea of documenting, it's not just presenting raw data, it's producing discourses of the real. It is cultural artifacts that are linked to a type of subjectivity, to a type of understanding the world that filters in the way that data that is presented. And it gives the audience a perspective on the way the audience needs to understand the data, right? And that's why cultural contexts and cultural discourses are really important here, because if we pay attention to the cultural context of discursive reality, we can understand the way different transnational actors relate to each other beyond the we can also talk about national actors, but in this case we can see how audience, for instance, Western audiences or European audiences should understand the experiences in Nanook, in Flaherty's Nanook. And the way they should understand it was through Flaherty's orientalizing gaze, through the exotic representation of this other Inuit culture that was so different from Western audiences, that certain props and staging needed to be done for us to actually understand them. In a way, it was an objectifying way of understanding these audiences. But the real point here that shouldn't be missed is not so much that these other cultures were objectified, exoticized, or othered. The point is that at that time, the cultural context required that. And that today, we need to pay attention of this type of mechanisms, of this, especially in a transnational context. We need to pay attention of that type of relationship. What kind of discourse, cultural discourse, what kind of discourse has been created due to a type of cultural context? So Franz Boas is another of those famous examples, and the whole idea that Inuits have different multiple words for snow, which linguists and anthropologists have discredited, because basically it's the same thing as we have in English. You could say that we have different words for water, and what we have is just simply different words, like waterfalls, dew, rain, right? Like those are bodies of water, and we have different names for that. So in the same way, Inuits have different ways of describing different stages of the snow. But from this ethnographic otherizing perspective at the time, we, I mean, when I say we, it's really they at the time, they Western readers would see these other realities, right? So you see how evidence is fictionalized because of the ethnographers, the anthropologists, the documentarian perspective, because of the way they're creating this discursive reality, right? So that, if we pay attention to that relationship, what we need to really understand is what type of power dynamics, in other words, what type of hegemonic relationships we can find between the quote unquote documentator, the one documenting, the one showing reality, between and what's documented, and finally the target audience. What kind of power relationships can we find in there? What kind of hegemonic views are at play? What is shown, but especially what is hidden in the production of this discursive reality, the production of this real, quote unquote. And when we look at that in a transnational context, we can unearth ways of seeing other communities, way of seeing other realities and presenting other realities due to different type of power dynamics. And you can actually put any other, not only power dynamics, but cultural epistemologies or ways of knowledge. Yeah, so there are different. So I'm using power dynamics because in a transnational context is the most glaring example, and to me is the most interesting example. But there are different type of theoretical frameworks that you can put in there. In this case, we're using power dynamics. So one of the most common ones today in contemporary societies is the idea that documenting to denounce. We document reality because there is a reality that needs to be denouncing. And if we understand that these denunciations and this documenting of reality as denunciation is not just showing evidence, that it's also constructing a reality, creating a type of fiction, then we need to understand that these documentaries, and it's also visual, but also written, they're a form of soft power beyond the reality of these claims. So that doesn't trump that what the documentary is showing is actually happening, but altogether is creating a discursive reality, a type of fiction. If we think about the role that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all these different organizations play when creating a political context, and depending on who is using the report and how the report is used, we can have different political confrontations. The case of Venezuela is one of those ones, right? How Venezuela plays in the American imaginary, in the European imaginary, right? And the National Endowment for Democracy, how that within Chinese geopolitics, but also before the 2000s, really, especially in the 90s, in the Latin American geopolitical context, the National Endowment for Democracy, in the reports it produced, were tools for U.S. Intervention. Now, in the context of the Chinese-American relationships, is a way to denounce, is a way for China to denounce U.S. interventions or even U.S. hegemony, right? But we can think of these other examples when it comes to any reports on China that for instance turn a blind eye of Guantanamo, the other way around, when China uses this idea of national interest and even the war on terror to intervene in Hong Kong, the same language that the US used to intervene in Iraq or in Afghanistan or Yemen. So these type of reports use a type of language, a type of framework that then later they're creating a political discourse that justifies a geopolitical action or a geopolitical position. Yeah, these denunciations, and then these denunciations are picked up and are transposed into film documentaries, right? And they are part of that soft power. When it comes to creating this imaginary about a country, what you think about, depending on what film documentaries or film documentation someone is watching, you can have an idea of China, of Venezuela, of Cuba, or of Catalonia in Spain, very differently, depending on how is that evidence interpreted. And there is no escape from this. There is no escape from data interpretation. So this is why film documentaries are important, because this is this symptom of this larger political reality that is created with the aid of cultural discourses, and it feeds a narrative. And I think the art of killing is one of those great examples. Not so it's a great example because a really complicated and sophisticated examples, right? And here we have one of the things that Pereira is claiming when it comes to visualizing genocide, and how the documentary visualizes this nightmarish allegory that really reminds the audience of Abu Ghraib. And in this sense, there's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not showing us directly these massacres that then reminds the audience of other massacres. It's showing us in this staging that reminds us of how really the American imaginary fueled these murderers, right? Anwar and Herman and the lot. It's pointing the finger at an aesthetic, at a style, at a cultural imaginary, and not saying that that is what caused it, but looking at how these discourses are embedded in other discourses that in this case are discourses of killing. Yeah. So I want to make clear that there is not a one-to-one relationship between American gangster movies and genocide in Indonesia. It is something that is more complicated, complex, and sophisticated. There's more layered to it, and this is why it's interesting. This is why the act of killing is really interesting. This is what later I will want you to discuss. So what I really want to focus is in this idea that documentaries are ways to denounce these narratives of evil. The documentaries denounce an evil character, and we in the audience positions ourselves as the quote-unquote good people, right? But in a counterintuitive way, the act of killing is rejecting that narrative, because what it's doing is not showing you the victim. So it's avoiding the re-victimization of those victims. And in that way, it's also pointing the finger at the audience, and in an indirect way, telling us to stop consuming third world people's pain, to stop looking at pain as a way to denounce, or to stop showing pain as a way to denounce inflicting pain, right? So, because the art of killing, it is really presented in the Western film festivals circles. It is one of those documentaries that many human rights organizations show to communicate the evils of genocide in other countries, and then in that way to garner support for humanitarian cause, and because it is in that context, in that specific context, it's even more glaring. It is even more glaring, this finger pointing that Oppenheimer is doing here. As much as the film features only bad people, it is also dealing with how good people in the audience is seeing and consuming evil. And it's asking a very pertinent question. How are we using all other people's pain to feel good about ourselves? Yeah, in our moral denunciation of what's happening. And the most interesting of all characters to me is Anwar, which is a central character. And this idea of when Anwar, as a subaltern per excellence, according to Spivak, right, an orientalized other per aspect speaking, is speaking really in the name of the imperial power, is speaking in the vocabulary of the Western traditions, of the free men of the West, right? This orientalized character, and here you have sort of the definition of what Orientalism is, and the idea of, you know, of Spivak's notion, which take it a little further from Said, when it comes to when asked the question, can the subaltern speak? And she, Spivak, answer yes, they can speak in certain contexts, but they're not allowed to, right? And it's a theoretical essay. So, but in this case, what the interesting part is that when the subaltern is speaking in the vocabulary of the West, right? And this is what I really want you to think about, right? This relationship between Anwar, the narrative of evil that is created, that is staged, that is performed, and we, quote unquote, as Western audiences, or at least at audiences outside of Indonesia, right? In how is it that Anwar can be both an authorized subject and the free man of the West per excellence, the preman, and the liberator of Indonesia communist rule, right? What is that telling us about how we, the audiences outside of Indonesia, don't really see evil through the victims, which is the common denunciatory narrative in film documentaries, right? How is it that we're seeing evil through victimizer, right? We see the evil through the victimizers, and the problem that we have is that they speak the same language of freedom that is used in the West to talk about the very evil people that they represent, right? So there's this paradox, right? And how is it, and how is it that the documentary is showing this paradox? To what purpose? To what end, right? And how close is it? How close is this Preman, this free man of the West, this Anwar Herman, to the West? And you know, when I say the West, really, it's really the West. Well, Europe and the US, you know, the hegemonic powers in the 21st century. How close it is to their narrative that justifies the war on terror, for instance, right? And in what way that camera is turned to us, right? Is metaphorically turned to us. Anwar is pointing the camera at us, right? And then I pose the question, finally, why? What I think Oppenheimer in the end is doing is asking the question: why you, audiences outside of Indonesia, Western audiences, why don't you consume your own evil, the evil that you have created, and more, you know, more implicitly in these human rights documentary film festival circles, what are you doing to stop your own evil that stems from the West, right? So thanks for listening. So we're gonna go into class discussion, and this is what I want you to do. Go to the PowerPoint, and then we'll further discuss all these concepts that I presented.